Welcome back, tenors and baritones. So I'm going to start off with a little bit of interesting piece of trivia about myself. I am related to President Lincoln. It's true. You are too? Yes. Great. Hi! What somebody is that? We'll talk. Okay. Now, I'm not named Lincoln. That's so awesome. All right. So I'm not named Lincoln because back in the day, of course, only sons got to pass down the family name. And my great-grandmother, Anna Lincoln, married a man named Knapp, and so we became the Knapps. But you know, Lincoln is one of those names you kind of want to hang on to if it's in your family. So it became a sort of hereditary middle name in my family, passed down from my grandpa, James Lincoln, to my dad, Charles Lincoln, and on to my nephew, Nicholas Lincoln. We hung on to that name because we were proud of our family heritage. We were proud to be sons and daughters of Abraham. See how I did that? All right. Actually, technically, we're more like second cousins of Abraham, but we were still proud of that. And I have to say that as a kid, I thought it was kind of cool to have that connection. Because we're not just talking about any president here, we're talking about Abraham Lincoln, as in, you know, Gettysburg Address. And I was especially proud to think that I was in the same family as the author of the Emancipation Proclamation. As if, like, I had something to do with that. As if being descended from that proclamation's author was any more remarkable than being descended from those who were freed by it, say. Now, some of you might remember a few years back, maybe 15 years ago, another president's family tree was suddenly in the news because a team of researchers announced that they now had DNA evidence that Thomas Jefferson had fathered at least one child with a woman named Sally Hemings, who was a slave in his household. The descendants of Eston Hemings, Sally's son, had always believed that Eston was Jefferson's son, but until then, they had had no corroborating evidence to support their claim, because Jefferson never acknowledged Sally's children as his heirs. And I know that when that story came out, there were people who were shocked to think that one of our founding fathers could have behaved in this way. But of course, if they'd read their Bibles, perhaps they'd have been a little less shocked. Because Jefferson was actually sort of following in the footsteps of another famous patriarch, wasn't he? Father Abraham, the song goes, had many kids. We don't know exactly how many, for starters, because the men who recorded the ancient genealogies somehow never bothered to learn the names of the daughters. But according to Genesis, we know that Abraham had at least 8 sons before he died. And we're concerned here today with 2 of them. Ishmael, Abraham's firstborn, and Isaac, Abraham's heir. Now, when I first learned that story as, you know, a little kid in Sunday school, this is what I learned. I learned that God had promised children to Abraham and Sarah, and that they had to wait a long time, but God always comes through on God's promises, and eventually that promise was fulfilled and they had a child. It wasn't until I was a little older that someone let slip that Abraham and Sarah had apparently gotten a little tired of waiting for God's promises, and that in the meantime, Abraham had fathered a child with a woman named Hagar, who was a slave in their household. Now, we don't know how Hagar felt about this, because like Sally Hemings, she didn't leave a diary to tell her side of the story. We are told that Abraham's wife, Sarah, initially welcomed Ishmael into the family, but that her attitude towards him changed after her own son, Isaac, was born. And so today, in today's reading, we read these words: "Cast out this slave woman and her son," Sarah tells Abraham, "for my son will not share his inheritance with the son of a slave." This is unfortunately one of the recurring themes of the book of Genesis. Not all children get to be heirs. Only the favored sons receive their father's blessing. And so generation after generation, siblings become rivals, competing for their birthright. Think of Jacob and Esau. Think of Joseph and his brothers. Think of Cain and Abel. Sometimes sibling rivalry becomes a fight to the death. Well, Ishmael pretty much disappears from the Genesis narrative after this story. We do learn that when Abraham died, Ishmael and Isaac buried him together. But we also learn that Abraham left all he had to Isaac alone. We do get a brief genealogy of Ishmael's sons, but from then on, his descendants are referred to in Genesis simply as Ishmaelites, not kin anymore, but foreigners. Well, Ishmael pretty much disappears from the Genesis narrative, but we can follow his story elsewhere. Because the Islamic tradition teaches that Ishmael became a prophet, the ancestor, in fact, of the great prophet, Muhammad. So Jews and Muslims, Sunnis and Shiites are all children of Abraham. Sometimes sibling rivalry becomes deadly. I recently discovered a website, Ancestry.com. Who here has tried out Ancestry.com? A few of you. Yeah. For those of you who have not tried it out yet, here's a warning. It's a little bit addictive when you first get on there. I don't play those like Candy Crush and things like that, so it's online Scrabble and Ancestry.com for me. So if you haven't tried it yet, Ancestry.com is a free genealogy website, and you enter as much as you know of your family history there. And first of all, it makes this beautiful, organized family tree. But it also searches for records that might refer to your relatives, census records, birth certificates, immigration documents, that sort of thing. And it's pretty cool uncovering these like buried fragments of your past as you dig deeper and deeper down into the roots of your family tree. I type in some names and dates from my grandmother's Bible, and all of a sudden I'm looking at my great-great-grandfather's name on a passenger manifest from the boat that brought him to North America. That's pretty cool. Well, shortly after I had discovered the website, a friend asked me to help her set up her own account because her mother was coming to visit, and she wanted to explore her family tree together with her mom. So the two of them sat down at the computer, and they began entering in the names and the dates that they could remember, and suddenly up popped a photograph of an attractive, old black and white photo of an attractive young couple, kind of posed cheek to cheek. She has just like a hint of a smile on her face. Beautiful photo. "Isn't that Grandma?" my friend said. "That's my mother and father," her mother answered. "I have that picture at home. It's their wedding picture. I don't understand. How did it get here?" So then they noticed the caption under the photo, which read, "Grandpa's sister and her husband, husband's name unknown." The photo you see had been posted to the website by another Ancestry.com user, a long-lost second cousin searching for the same common ancestors. Well, my friend and I were both totally thrilled to think that we had discovered a long-lost relative, but her mother was sort of taken aback. And she just kept saying, "I don't understand. Who could this person be?" And then suddenly her eyes grew wide, and she sort of drew in a breath, and she said, oh, she must be Edgar's family. "So, who is Edgar?" I asked. "He stole from the family," was all that her mother knew. She was stunned, I think, to consider that Edgar's grandchildren might be reaching out to her as their kin. I think we sometimes forget that as we trace our family backwards, it gets bigger. Not just deeper, but wider. I had 2 parents, but I have 16 great-grandparents. Go back 5 generations, and we're talking over 100 ancestors. That's a lot of fifth cousins. When I wrote this out, I said I was going to say, maybe some of you in this room right now, but I got one, right? Of course, if you go back a few thousand years, we're all related. But can we embrace all these kindred as kin? Most of them are strangers to us. Some of them might even be enemies. And it's always tempting to prune away the unwelcome branches of the family tree. It's always tempting to believe that ours is the true vine, chosen branch. So who is Abraham's rightful heir? Genesis, of course, offers one answer, but the Quran offers another. And actually, the Gospel of Matthew offers a third. The very first sentence in the Gospel of Matthew says, a genealogy of Jesus the Messiah, son of David, son of Abraham. But the interesting thing is, if you go on to read the rest of that first chapter of Matthew, Matthew makes clear two facts. One, Joseph was a direct patrilineal descendant of Abraham. Two, Jesus is not Joseph's son, right? No wonder Jesus responded to John's message that God could raise up children of Abraham from the rocks. Jesus, you see, had a different idea of what makes a family, and it wasn't based on bloodlines. His earlier followers picked up on this idea. Take Paul, for example. The Apostle Paul was Jewish. He described himself as a Pharisee among Pharisees. So here was a son of Abraham, if ever there was one. And yet he became convinced that his mission was to bring into the family of Christ not just his fellow Jews, not just Abraham's heirs, but even the Gentiles, the Greeks and the Romans. And in his letter to the Romans, Paul speaks of a spirit of adoption that calls them into the family of God. You are no longer slaves, he tells them, but children, and if children, then heirs. All of them, all of us. Abraham may have given all he had to Isaac alone, but God has enough for all of us. God's blessing went with Ishmael as well as with Isaac. When God spoke to Hagar in the wilderness, he said, "Do not be afraid, for God has heard the voice of your boy. Lift him up and hold him fast, for I will make a great nation of him." God, you see, claims us all as his heirs. The promise is for you and your children and for all who are far off. Not just the favored sons, but the unnamed daughters. Not just the rightful heirs, but the disinherited, the enslaved or the orphaned. Not just for Isaac and Jacob, but for Ishmael and Esau, for Eston, and for Edgar. Whether our ancestors traveled on the Mayflower or on the Amistad, God was with them. God heard their prayers just as God heard the prayers of Hagar and of Sally Hemings, that their children might live to see a better day, a day in which all God's children might finally learn to claim one another as kin. Father Abraham had many kids. I'm one of them, and so are you. So let's all praise the Lord. Amen.